Are you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
You need a
I'm
sip of
ready.
water? Towel round your neck?
Do you know what? Yes,
breather?
yes. Let
Bit of
me get a
stretch?
sip of water.
Okay.
I need to psych myself up for this.
President Macron of France commissioned a report which declared that a large amount of African cultural heritage was no longer in Africa. What was the figure the report claimed? Was it A, 20 to 25%, B, 50 to 55%, or C, 90 to 95%?
I think it is most definitely 90 to 95%.
Correct. Of course, we have to take that figure with a sort of pinch of salt, in that that would imply that there's only 5% of African cultural heritage in Africa, which, we have to kind of recognise that culture didn't end with the end of colonialism. So, staying on this theme, if you can prove that an object has been stolen, a museum has to return it under international law, but only if it has been taken since when? Is it A, 1960, B, 1970, or C, 1980?
Oh, I know this. It is 1970.
Correct. 1970, answer B. This refers to the UNESCO Convention preventing the illicit import, export and transfer of ownership of cultural property. So what do you think of that then?
That's not even that long ago, when you really think about it. It's a little bit of a cop-out for me, that one.
Your next question is, if a country asks another country to return human remains, then by law they have to return them. A, yes, B, no, or C, maybe, it depends.
I'm definitely going with maybe it depends.
Very wise. I've learnt in my museum career that 90% of answers to museum ethics questions are C, maybe, it depends. It is an extremely complex area, as you say.
How did I do?
Good. Is this triggering exam trauma for you?
I think that I passed the quiz, but Sarah then turned the tables and had some more questions for me.
I'm really interested to know, with all these different museums you visited, what you think is the single most important thing museums could do to improve with all that you've seen.
I think it starts with the truth, then letting people know what they're looking at, then it's facing what that reality is, and then seeing a more positive human way forward, and then action, because nothing happens without action.
And you said you hadn't really been to a museum since you were a child. With all of these visits you've been doing recently, how did you feel as a visitor in the museum? Did you find it a pleasurable experience?
The thing is I really did. So I totally understand the appeal of the museums and how important it is, but it's also about doing it the right way, not having these things in here at any cost. That was literally my thought process, going to different places, like, oh, this one's honest about this. Ooh, this is beautiful. I know how that was taken, so I'm not really happy about that. They're not even telling the people. So it was just this constant battle with my mind. So is there anything else what is really important to you?
The other very important thing is, what are we collecting now for future generations? Whose history are we collecting? How are we in fact collecting things about the Black Lives Matter movement today for future generations to know about? Whose history is considered powerful and important and valuable? We're telling and reflecting the story and history and making sense of ourselves as a society, the social fabric. So when a society doesn't fully understand its own history and the place of Black, Asian and other minority ethnic people in that history and in that society, it basically means that racism goes unchecked. And so if we are to fight racial injustice, and if museums are to be a tool of social justice, then we have to be not perpetuating those same racial inequalities within ourselves as organisations, because we're storytellers. We're storytellers on behalf of the nation. So if Black Lives Matter is to mean anything, it's to mean that we are moving forward towards a more racially just society.
Wow. And that, dear listeners, is where we must leave Finders Keepers for now. It's been an amazing journey, even in lockdown, to see all these objects, hear all these opinions, and learn that while it's not as simple as just giving back everything that was plundered in colonial times, the actions that museums take now really can have a bearing on the people who visit them, and also the people who want to get their things back, and rebalance the historical scales. My name is Kemisa Causeway, and you've been listening to the final episode of Finders Keepers on the Compass. If you'd like to find the other programmes in the series, you can go to BBC Sounds. For this episode, special thanks goes to Vai Harawira and Tirunanga Onatiawa. The sound engineer in New Zealand was Jared Dodd, and the storyteller was Maria Elliott. The theme music for this series was composed by me, Kemisa Causeway, aka Kema K. My producers were Andy Jones and Will Sadler. Our series editor was Penny Murphy, and this has been a Scattered Pictures production for the BBC World Service.
This is the BBC World Service, with the story of the 1961 mission to send the first person into space.
Hundreds of kilometers above the Earth, Yuri Gagarin is witness to a spectacle that no human in history before him ever experienced.
Yuri Gagarin was embraced by the leader of the communist world as the hero of a communist victory.
In doing so, it became an instrument of a new conflict, the Cold War, an ideological battle between the superpowers.
To beat the Americans, huge shortcuts were taken. At one point, they weren't even going to design a spacesuit because they didn't have time.
The Soviet space program would deliver blow after shaming blow on the Americans.
It gets the American people alarmed that a foreign country, especially an enemy country, can do this. We fear this.
Gagarin and the Lost Moon, in half an hour.
We have technology for you this half hour here on the BBC World Service. I'm Gareth Mitchell. For many of us, voice is likely to become the main way in which we interact with technology. Yet the voice assistants from the big tech companies cater for no native African languages. And that's despite the fact that the Kiswahili and Kinyarwanda languages alone are spoken by well over 100 million people across East Africa. We hear about one project setting out to address that. It's all coming up on Digital Planet after the news.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. Crowds have gathered outside the High Court in Pietermaritzburg, where the former South African President Jacob Zuma is due to appear in a much-delayed corruption trial. He's expected to plead not guilty to charges of fraud and racketeering. The case dates back to an arms deal in the 1990s. The president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, has defended the forced diversion of a Ryanair flight to Minsk, where an opposition journalist was taken off the plane and arrested. In his first comments since the incident on Sunday, Mr. Lukashenko said he'd acted in line with international law. WhatsApp is suing the Indian government over new laws that will compel it to violate privacy protections. The legislation requires internet companies to trace the origins of inflammatory messages. WhatsApp said it means it will have to break the end-to-end encryption its users enjoy. The United Nations has said that the European Union is partly to blame for the deaths of migrants in the Mediterranean. Hundreds of people lose their lives each year trying to reach the continent by sea. The UN highlighted moves by some European countries to reduce search and rescue operations, ignore distress calls, and prosecute aid workers who try to help. In Britain, the former chief aide to the Prime Minister is about to testify to MPs investigating the government's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. Dominic Cummings is expected to accuse Boris Johnson of being much too slow to tighten restrictions last autumn. Syrians are voting in a presidential election being held in the two-thirds of the country that the government controls. President Assad is facing two little-known challengers and is expected to win a crushing victory and another 7-year mandate. His opponents have described the election as a theatrical farce. BBC News.
Hello everybody, I'm Gareth Mitchell and this is Digital Planet. Today, banking thousands of voices for better voice assistance, also more machine learning on the machine in your pocket, and finding your feet in VR with electronic socks. We have Bill Thompson here for some comment and let's see if he puts his foot in it. Hello, Bill.
Hello there, Gareth. Well, these boots are made for walking, so I'm going to walk all over the stories.
Ooh, nicely done. All right, now let's jump in with this one. Could your voice assistant understand this?
Muraho neza. Ubu maze iminsi ibiri ndwaye. Ubu mfite inkorora, nkaba mfite n'umuriro. Ubu ntago byaba bingaragariza ko ndwaye COVID.
Well, basically, it probably wouldn't, because that's in the Kinyarwanda language, and it's not served by any of the commercially available smart assistants from the big tech companies, even though that language is spoken by at least 10 million people in Rwanda, Eastern DRC, and neighbouring countries. The person in that clip is actually saying, I have a cough and a temperature. Could these be symptoms of COVID-19? Now, his voice and thousands of others are being captured to train a Kinyarwanda chatbot so that people can find out about COVID just through talking. It's part of a project called Common Voice by Mozilla. They're the people behind the Firefox browser. And the initiative has just had a big cash injection to expand into Kiswahili, spoken widely across Eastern and Southern Africa. I've been hearing about the technical challenges involved and what the team hopes to achieve. Remy Muhire joined me from Kigali just now. He's the community lead at Common Voice Kinyarwanda. But first, Chenai Che, Special Advisor for Africa Innovation at the Mozilla Foundation in Johannesburg.
We're talking about Kiswahili, which is actually spoken in like Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and South Sudan. So in its various dialects and its various understandings, this is actually a language family that covers quite a number of African countries.
So if you're in Kampala or Nairobi, for instance, Kigali, and you want to use a voice device, you have to do so in English, or at least not in a native African language. You know, English, French, you're fine, but otherwise you just have to not bother.
Yeah, and you have to use it in an English accent that the machine can understand, right? So that the AI system can understand. So we find in some instances people having to actually adjust the way they speak so that the voice assistant can actually understand what they're saying. Or if they say something, they end up with like a different set of information because they can't nuance that accent.
So one of your projects is to develop a chatbot for COVID advice in the Kinyarwanda language, isn't it? Remy, tell me about that.
The chatbot actually aims to strengthen communication on COVID-19 with the government of Rwanda and citizens. So a lack of verbal information were actually very key in fighting the pandemic, because people weren't actually having access to verbal information, especially people who actually don't have access on the internet. And this solution comes with a speech engine, and where actually a citizen will be calling on an interactive voice system and asking actually a question in native languages, and the chatbot will be actually replying to them.
So the whole point, this is a machine learning algorithm, and it needs to have training data, and naturally for a voice assistant, the training data needs to be voices. So how are you capturing these hundreds, indeed thousands, of voices in order to train the algorithm?
So the voices are captured on Common Voice, and Common Voice is a Mozilla platform, and where contributors will come and read a sentence, a fragment of sentence, in order to give their voice.
So, okay, so you have a sentence that people have to say, and you need lots of voices saying that sentence. But then you also have a way of inviting others to validate. People have to vote for whether they believe that voice is authentic. So there's some quality control built in.
So the validation process is actually a double validation. So they're actually a first validation of the voice contributed, and they're actually a second validation to make sure that the voice is accurate and comparing to the text.
What's the biggest technical challenge in making this all work?
I think the biggest challenge is more of the data. yes, we have 2,000 hours, but it's not enough because training actually a very accurate model requires actually 10,000 hours of voice. And this is the work actually we do on a daily basis, collecting more hours in order actually to train and retrain those models to be very effective.
And what about the different accents and dialects? How, I suppose, diverse is the Kinyarwanda language in terms of just the way people pronounce all the different words?
I think this is like another challenge as well because like in different parts of Rwanda, people speak in Rwanda, but people speak in Rwanda differently, right? And eliminating actually those biases require us actually getting enough data as possible.
Right, so far you're getting some initial successes in the Kinyarwanda language, but then also you're developing this, you're widening it out, you have money now to go into Kiswahili, spoken so widely across East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan and others. Tell me about Kiswahili.
The Kiswahili actually differ a lot because the one in Kenya, it's mixed with English, so it's mainly called Shank. And the one in Tanzania, it's mixed with Arabic. And there's also like another Kiswahili, which is mixed with French in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo.
And Chenai, I assume that the big technology companies will have huge banks of voice data from lots of different languages, but they're closed away to be commercialised. The model is very different with Mozilla, isn't it?
This is actually an open source project. And when we were talking about democratizing and diversifying the voice space, we're actually saying that Common Voice as a platform enables people to donate their voices to a free and publicly available database that startups, researchers, and developers can actually use to train voice-enabled apps, products, and services. So this is what makes it different, that it's actually a public data set that people have access to and have an understanding of how they're donating their resources and can be used by local developers.
But I just wonder with this, like here comes everybody approach, how you're going to eliminate biases, how you're going to make sure that all possible voices are represented here.
One of the criticisms that emerges around voice work is the lack of having people who are actually on the ground who understand these issues. And our machine learning fellow and community engagement fellows that are going to become on board are people that are part of the Kiswahili community. And in responding to the issues around bias, the methodology that we will be implementing in building the models will be working towards recognizing bias in terms of gender, age, and also accents, regional accents. So this is part of the work that we're making sure that as we're designing this data set, as we're collecting the data that's needed, it's something that's taking into account. And I think also just ensuring that we, even as we're collecting the amount of data that's needed, in terms of having the sufficient number of hours, we will be cleaning up data that may be problematic. We will be doing tagging of the data to make sure that we've got data that is actually relevant and reveals and is representative of the communities, because one of the issues with current voice systems is that they work better for men than they do for women. So this is definitely something that we will be looking out for in the design and in the development of the models. The people that we have on board as our fellows are people who are cognizant of these issues. So they're people who've written around the biases that exist within voice systems.
That's Chenai Che and Remy Muhire. And Bill Thompson, I wonder, I mean, there's obviously so many, these are widely spoken languages, so you would assume there must be other projects working on this kind of issue.
There are, and it's been really good to see the community sort of come together like this. There's an established project called Masakane, which means we build together in isiZulu. And they are also building, it's an open source AI project to develop machine translation systems, not just to do sort of voice recognition. So there's so much work in natural language processing going on. I mean, again, not just across the African continent, but around the world, reflecting the languages that have not been important enough for the big players to take notice of. And it's not surprising, but it's also slightly depressing that given their resources, they haven't put the effort in. I think they would argue that they refine the technologies using the most common languages like English. Once the technology is ready, then it becomes easier to train models. But there is still such a delay in the availability of voice recognition systems and machine translation systems that will work in less common languages. And it's starting to be a problem because these technologies are being built into the devices that millions, billions of people have. People are starting to rely on them. And it needs to we need to correct that balance. So it's good to see what Common Voice, Massacane and other people are doing.
Okay, Bill, thank you. So, speech could be set to become the main way that many of us interact with technology in the coming years, and that'll bring loads of benefits, but also big costs, environmental costs, given the energy-hungry data centres that power all this technology. But an approach is emerging that promises to drastically reduce emissions, and it's been up for discussion in recent days at the rather charmingly named 2021 Flower Summit. This is federated learning, and instead of shipping all the data from our phones and gadgets all the way to a massive server farm in the middle of a desert somewhere, keep the data where it is on our devices and then build the machine learning model there. And after that, the model on my device and yours and millions of others can be merged into the big algorithm up there in the cloud. That's the idea. Well, I've been hearing more from one of those at the Flower Summit, Dr. Nick Lane, a senior lecturer in the Department of Computer Science and Technology at the University of Cambridge, where he leads the Machine Learning Systems Lab.
So the advancement that we've been making in machine learning had come at the price of using lots and lots of electricity. I can think of a paper, NLP, so that's models that understand text. The state-of-the-art model for them, if you just trained that model once, would actually take as much energy and therefore produce as much carbon as 5 cars based in America for their whole lifetime. The underlying trend is that since 2012, machine learning models have been requiring a doubling of compute every 3 months. If we just extrapolate, things are going to get worse and worse very, very quickly. And so now there's this realization that a lot of the breakthroughs have come on the back of quite severe carbon consequences.
Perhaps you could give us an example of machine learning that we encounter every day on our devices and on our laptops.
An obvious one would be the web. So web search, you might go to Google or your favorite search engine, you type in a nice query, and then you get a series of results back. Now, if you take, for example, the case where you search for images, right? So I can type in a very natural phrase, and the images that I get back rarely correspond to that text that I just wrote in. Now, what's happening and what's underneath the hood is that query is uploaded to a data center, and then not just a single machine learning model, but multiple models are at work trying to understand, for example, the text that I just typed in, and also on the content side, trying to understand what's the content. So in the case of an image, there's a vision model that understands visually what is in that image and maps it to the text I just typed. In the case on the input side of the text that I typed, there's an NLP model that's understanding what the query is really getting at, and then aligning these two things together. And you can imagine that on a daily basis, every time someone submits a query, there are multiple of these sort of potentially quite heavy models running.
So with things like our voice assistants and web search, we're sending our data to a server somewhere where the machine learning, deep learning algorithm happens, and then it spits an answer back to us. How is federated learning different?
So federated learning comes from a place of wanting to diminish the potential privacy side effects of all of this. Folks have rightly become sensitive to uploading images or audio to a cloud. And so as a consequence, there was an invention of another paradigm whereby you can train and create these models, but the data that is the input to these models can remain on the device. Normally, you'd want to collate all of this data into a data center and then train on it and to produce that model. Under federated learning, all of that training data can just sit on a device. The device performs some local computation that essentially generates a signal given to the data center, but the signals that are being sent are, they're sort of these gradients that alter the parameters of the model, but they are not the raw input.
What about applications for federated learning that all of us might encounter in our daily lives?
So an example of that would be if you've got an Android phone, all of those keyboard prediction services are based on federated learning, and because it offers people this nice protection that their raw text does not need to be uploaded, so there's sort of privacy about what they're writing, and yet they can still have these really accurate prediction services available to them. But there is another important dimension to federated learning, and that is enabling organizations to benefit from each other's data but while still protecting the user's privacy. So one example of this would be in the medical domain. And we now can build models that understand and can detect cancers and different things. So hospitals individually, as separate organizations, can build up information about their patients. So where federated learning can come into play is that it can facilitate the best possible model to be trained, but without requiring that data to ever leave the hospital. And so patients can feel very confident and about the protection of their data. There's no sort of accident of private information being leaked, and yet there can be a much smaller downside to the quality of the model. Because they don't have to be stuck in this awkward situation of having a model that was perhaps trained on just a relatively smaller amount of data that's available just in one organization.
Can you put a number on how much this is reducing emissions, reducing the amount of energy needed to process all our data on our devices?
We're only really in the early stages of it, so it's probably unfair to sort of look at how much more efficient is it today, but the question is how much more efficient could be moving forward. So for example, to support all of the compute that trains these models requires us to kind of bring a lot of computation all together in one place. And once you start to do that, because of the thermal issues you face, you need to cool that compute. These numbers vary from data center to data center, but you can easily have a data center that spends 60% of its energy just on cooling alone. Now, when you have a federated learning form of doing the same task, because the compute is physically dislocated, you don't have to spend that overhead on cooling.
Where is this all going then? What do you see in the future?
Well, federated learning, and especially how it relates to the environment, is really going to be supercharged. We can't carry on the way we're currently approaching the problem because it's just costing too much energy. And so we have to seek out alternatives. So in the last 12 months, machine learning as an area has made a lot of strides in being able to use not labeled data, but unlabeled data. As the unsupervised methods grow up and mature, we're going to see massive inflows of data being sort of a very commonplace activity. And unless we can replace centralized training, we're going to face a huge overhead of moving that data. And a promising alternative is to decentralize, because we can cut out the cooling, and also the underlying communication can be severely reduced. So when that happens, federated learning will be a sort of a key approach necessary for us to continue the sort of migration that we've been seeing.
That's Nick Lane. So, Bill Thompson, do you see federated learning as being one solution to all these energy-hungry processing centres?
It's part of a solution. As ever, it's not going to solve the problem all by itself, but absolutely. And I have to say, I'm quite a fan of federated learning. I think it's a really elegant way of thinking about the problem of creating trained neural networks, of trained models for machine learning that allows you to preserve privacy, as we heard there from Nick, and that's why it was done. But it has all these additional benefits. And as we become more and more dependent on machine learning systems to drive all the technologies we're working with, including cars we drive, see what I did there, we will have this issue about how all these models are constantly updated, and they need to be updated because the data available to them changes. If we want to avoid bias in these systems, we're going to have a way of revising them rapidly. Doing that the conventional way with massive data centers won't work, I don't think, for practical reasons. What we heard, schlepping the data around is just going to be hard, but it also has environmental impact. So it's nice to see a systems design that takes environmental issues into account right at the start, instead of having to fix it after the fact.
All right, Bill, thank you. Well, now finally, finding your feet in virtual reality. So there you are, deep in an experience, scaling down the side of a building, escaping zombies, or walking around an art gallery, perhaps. Except, of course, you're just sitting on your sofa in the real world, whilst your avatar is doing all the moving around in the virtual world. But researchers in Japan are experimenting with different ways of making your feet feel as if they're walking or running. And one device they've come up with is a pair of electronic socks. Sounds intriguing. The work has recently been published in the journal Frontiers in Virtual Reality, and I've just been finding out more from reporter Claire Jordan, who's been looking at the research.
One of the barriers to becoming immersed in virtual reality is movement, since navigating around a virtual world is pretty integral to the enjoyment of most games. And when gamers move around in virtual reality while sitting down or standing still, this can cause something that's known as the VR locomotion problem. So it's similar to travel sickness, and it makes users feel a bit ill because your brain struggles to reconcile the movement seen from your eyes with the static position of the rest of the body.
So it's not great if VR makes you feel sick. So what are the current solutions then?
So it's made horror games and roller coaster simulators really popular, as these kind of games play into that feeling of nausea. But not everybody wants to play them, so engineers have developed various physical solutions for replicating movement. Some of these have been around for quite a while, like the moving platforms you might have seen maybe at a theme park. They replicate sort of roller coasters, rocket launches, or maybe you've seen the video of a journalist screaming as he virtually slides down a slide over London. And these moving platforms are quite immersive, but they're usually pre-programmed, so you as the user, you can't control where you're moving in the virtual space. To give gamers the ability to actually move, omnidirectional treadmills and low-friction platforms have been developed, which are just starting to come to market. And to use them, the gamer is strapped into a harness, so you can move around in VR whilst actually physically staying in one place. But the problem is that they're pretty expensive and have a few problems, such as they've got to be configured to the size of each user, and there's quite a steep learning curve to physically move in the way you want your game avatar to move.
Yeah, no, I can see the limitations there, but you've been finding out about a completely new approach, and that's being developed by a team in Japan.
That's right. So Professor Yazuke Matsuda from Toyohashi University of Technology, he researches psychology and engineering for virtual reality, and his team are pioneering a completely different way of creating the feeling of walking in VR.
This proposal system allows users to experience walking by simply wearing a head-mount display and placing their feet on a walking device. Users could see the actual movement of the avatar's feet through mirrors. The tactile stimuli were generated from the sound of footsteps. These vibrations were presented to the heels and forefoot, synchronized with the avatar's foot striking the floor.
This is a really different method for creating a feeling of movement. Instead of actually moving, the user just has to wear what I like to think of as kind of electronic socks that vibrate in time with the footsteps of the virtual reality avatar.
Oh, I like that, electronic socks, yeah. So with these electronic socks on, did the test subjects really get a feeling that they were walking? I mean, how might that have worked?
So the initial experiments have been very positive. People really did feel like they were actually walking. And we think it might be working in a similar way to something called the mirror box trick, which is where you can convince the brain it feels something touching a prosthetic limb by using a mirror and a tactile stimulus, so the feeling of something on a real limb. But instead of a physical mirror, obviously in this case people were shown a mirror in virtual reality to convince their brains that the movement they saw on screen, which matched the vibrations on their feet and the sound in their ears, was the movement they were actually doing.
And does this make it better than these treadmills that can move in multiple directions then? Are they getting basically some good results out of this research, Claire?
Well, it's still early days in development, but static solutions for virtual reality movement have a lot of benefits. For example, when it comes to things like inclusivity, Professor Matsuda explained.
Most of the proposed walking experience device requires users to move their own feet, but it has the disadvantage of making the experience difficult for people with mobility issues. We believe that the proposed method can provide the feeling of walking just by sitting. The method can bring this walking sensation to people with walking disabilities relatively easily.
So this could be really, really beneficial to a lot of people who want to experience movement in virtual reality, but who might find using treadmills difficult. And this sort of tech is also likely to be a lot cheaper than the bulky platforms designed for physical movement. So I think that in the near future, we might see those in games arcade, but electronic socks more for use in the home.
All right then, but how far in the near future will we all be able to get pairs of these electronic socks? Because I'm dying to try a pair out at some point.
So this was just an initial study. It's still very early days, says Professor Yazuke Matsuda.
The current system uses passive stimuli, so the user cannot move by their own will. We will need a system that allows users to move freely. The application will expand even further, so it is worth studying, I think. My next research plan is to investigate how we can incorporate active decision-making into the current walking experience system.
So you won't be getting your electronic socks for some time yet, But this research really does present a great opportunity to improve the immersive VR experience without the need to fill your living room or your study with like a big, bulky and really expensive treadmill. And aside from the obvious opportunities in video gaming, it might open up a new line of important research in using VR for physiotherapy and allowing people with disabilities to have the feeling of walking.
That's Claire Jordan, who was hearing from Yusuke Matsuda. Final few words from you then, Bill. It's an exciting research area for sure.
It is, and it's interesting the technology they're using for this. I think what I take from this is, everything that Claire said about the importance of VR is absolutely the case. And what we're starting to see now, what we've seen over the last few years, is using touch or using force feedback, using what are called haptics, is becoming a new design discipline. So many of us will have mobile phones, smartphones that have some sort of force feedback or vibrate in interesting ways. Apple call this taptics on the iPhone. It's available for Android as well. And figuring out how to fool the human brain into thinking that you've pressed a button on a rigid glass screen, thinking how to fool the human brain into thinking that you're walking through a virtual reality environment, thinking how to make us feel that when we have sort of move our hands, something else is happening than is really happening, is becoming sort of really important. Because our expectations of the devices around us are that they give us this the simulacrum of this reality, that they're more than they really are. And we're really just starting to scratch the surface of what it is possible to achieve, because as a species, we so want to be fooled. It is actually so easy to make us believe something that is not true in the physical world by giving us the appropriate little pokes and jabs in the right place. And I'm fascinated to see how this will develop into a haptics language, and how we'll see more and more sophisticated devices using it, not just in virtual reality, but with augmented reality and with the smartphones that are now ubiquitous in our lives.
Well, you've given us a real feel for that, Bill. I'm touched. Thank you. Well, the studio manager is Donald McDonald, the producer is Anya Literovich, and I'm Gareth Mitchell. We'll have more next week. Goodbye.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, and here's Harriet Gilbert to tell you about the next World Book Club.
Set in Mumbai, Serious Men is a comedy about caste, prejudice, parenthood and ambition. Ian dreams of a better future for his family, but his scheme to make people think his son's a child genius is a deception that spins out of control.
Serious Men by Manu Joseph from the 5th of June. And at bbcworldservice.com, people fixing the world.
We check back in with some of our problem solvers. Did their plans to fix the world with bus stickers and volcano forecasts work out how they hoped?
Stay with us, the documentary is next, here on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
From the BBC World Service, the story of the first human to fly into the vastness of space.
Yuri Gagarin, 60 years ago, is the first human being to look down and see the Earth for what it is, this sphere in space.
The sky is black, and around the edge of the Earth, around the edge of the horizon, such a beautiful halo.
By travelling faster and further than any human before him, Yuri Gagarin became an instrument in the conflict between two superpowers, East versus West.
Yuri Gagarin was embraced by the leader of the communist world as the hero of a communist victory.
But a spectacular lead in the space race didn't guarantee ultimate victory. Coming up in the next hour, Gagarin and the Lost Moon with me, Kevin Fong.
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. Hundreds of people have gathered outside a court in South Africa for the delayed corruption trial of the former president Jacob Zuma. The once celebrated hero of the anti-apartheid struggle has pleaded not guilty to charges of fraud and racketeering in a case that dates back to an arms deal in the 1990s. The former president has described the trial as a politically motivated witch hunt. Speaking to the BBC outside the courthouse in Pietermaritzburg, Mr. Zuma's son Edward said he hoped justice would be done.
He's been innocent from day one, and he's been ready for the case from day one. The people should not be saying he's been delaying his day in court. He was merely exercising his constitutional rights, which he fought for, and if his constitutional rights are denied, what was the use of him fighting for the liberation of this country?
The president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, has defended the forced diversion of a Ryanair plane to Minsk in his first comments since the incident on Sunday. An opposition journalist and his girlfriend, who were on the flight from Greece to Lithuania, were arrested when it landed in the Belarusian capital. Steve Rosenberg was listening.
This speech paints a picture of the world according to Lukashenko, and it is a world in which he sees himself as the victim, surrounded by external and internal threats. He has said that he acted legally on Sunday with this whole Ryanair plane drama. He said he was protecting people according to international law. He said it was a total lie that the MiG fighter he'd sent up had forced that Ryanair jet to land in Minsk.
A BBC investigation has been told that emotion recognition technology designed to prejudge a person's guilt is being tested on Uyghur people in Western China. The allegations were made by a software engineer who has installed the artificial intelligence at police stations in Xinjiang province. The Chinese authorities did not respond to BBC questions about the software. Human Rights Watch described it as shocking. WhatsApp is suing the Indian government over new laws that will compel it to violate its privacy protections. The legislation, which comes into effect today, requires internet companies to trace the origins of inflammatory messages sent on their platforms. Here's Alexa Naismith.
Narendra Modi wants to tighten the leash on big tech companies, announcing the legislation after Twitter ignored government orders to drop content related to India's ongoing farmers' protest. But WhatsApp, owned by Facebook, says it's a violation of privacy. The legally enforceable rules mean WhatsApp will have to break its end-to-end encryption, meaning all users' messages are traceable. The company is asking Delhi's High Court to rule the move unconstitutional.
World News from the BBC. A severe cyclone has hit the east coast of India. Cyclone Yas made landfall over Odisha, bringing torrential rain and winds of up to 140 kilometres an hour. Over 1.5 million people have been evacuated from low-lying areas there. The UN's Human Rights Office says the European Union is partly to blame for the deaths of migrants trying to reach the continent by sea. In a new report into the plight of the tens of thousands of migrants who cross the Mediterranean in small boats each year, the UN said political decisions were causing unnecessary deaths. The former chief aide to the British Prime Minister has strongly criticised the government's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. At the start of his evidence to MPs about the crisis, Dominic Cummings said there was a lack of a sense of urgency at the start of the outbreak last year.
The truth is that senior ministers, senior officials, senior advisers like me fell disastrously short of the standards that the public has a right to expect of its government in a crisis like this. When the public needed us most, the government failed. And I'd like to say to all the families of those who died unnecessarily how sorry I am for the mistakes that were made and for my own mistakes at that.
The former chief aide has become an arch critic of his former boss Boris Johnson since he left last November. Downing Street has said its priority was always to save lives. Cuba says the United States has granted visas to its national baseball team to participate in a qualifying tournament in Florida for the Tokyo Olympics. The process of applying for American visas had been made difficult by the suspension of consular services in Havana by the Trump administration. The coronavirus pandemic exacerbated the problem. But Washington allowed the team to make an application in Havana last week. Baseball is Canada's national sport. BBC News.
An historic recording from 60 years ago. The voice of the first human to fly in space. And for the next hour, I'll be telling his story. I'm Kevin Fong, and from the BBC World Service, this is Gagarin and the Lost Moon.
Today, the 12th of April, 1961, the first cosmic spaceship named Vostok, when a man on board was orbited round the Earth from the Soviet Union.
The motherland hears, the motherland knows, where her son is flying through the clouds. With friendly embrace, with tender love, she watches over you.
He is Airman Major Yuri Gagarin, an Air Force pilot, a citizen of the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic.
Yuri Gagarin, 60 years ago, almost to the day, is the first human being to escape the biosphere, to escape the cave, effectively, that we have all been inhabiting since life began on this planet. The first to step outside, the first to look down and see the Earth for what it is, this sphere in space. The first to see how beautiful our planet is, the first to see its majesty, the first to see how thin that atmosphere is, its fragility as well.
Yuri Gagarin, an explorer like none other before him, going faster and further than any human in history into what had always been the impenetrable and infinite unknown. Raised on a farm in the midst of the Second World War, this one-time factory worker, a citizen of the Soviet Union, became the first human to fly above the Earth in the vastness of space. In doing so, he became an instrument of a new conflict, the Cold War, an ideological battle between the superpowers, East versus West, communism versus democracy.
Today, in this scene at Moscow Airport, Yuri Gagarin was embraced by the leader of the communist world as the hero of a communist victory. And in a day of wild jubilation, he was embraced by the Soviet people as a new pioneer, an image of their pride and their ambitions. A Columbus, a Lindy, Lenin in a spacesuit.
More than 3 years before Gagarin's flight, the world had in an instant become all too aware of the Soviet Union's lead in the space race. In October 1957, there was the shock of Sputnik, a metal sphere the size of a beach ball transmitting an insistent beep to the world from orbit.
This is Radio Moscow. As a result of intensive work by research institutes and designing bureaus, the first artificial Earth satellite in the world has now been created. This first satellite was today successfully launched in the USSR.
Within US government circles, people had known they were in competition with the Soviets to launch the first satellite, but to lose was a national humiliation. Tom Ellis, a space historian at the London School of Economics.
There's an amazing quote by this American journalist and writer called John Gunther, where he says that before Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, American folklore had it that Russians were hardly capable of operating a tractor. You know, there's this stereotype of Russian technological incompetence within the United States, and that completely changes with Sputnik.
Do you admire the Russians for doing it or not?
No, definitely not. I said we should have been the first ones to have it, if there's such thing.
It gets the American people alarmed that a foreign country, especially an enemy country, can do this, and we fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
In what remained of the 1950s, the Soviet space program would deliver blow after shaming blow on the Americans. Robert Siemens was an official in the nascent US space program during that period.
Sputnik got a lot of world publicity, and whether the Soviets had planned it or not, to this day nobody really quite knows, but when they found out the impact this had, and then they played on it, and then they would take another step, like putting a dog in space, or they went around the moon and took a picture of the backside of the moon.
The Soviets were ahead in all of this, thanks to more powerful and more reliable ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles, than the Americans. Designed for the purpose of carrying heavy nuclear warheads, their giant R-7 rocket was just as effective for putting satellites and dogs into orbit. The Soviets had stolen a march on the US with this missile thanks to an engineer named Sergei Korolev, the mastermind of the new space program. A decade ago, the BBC spoke to Soviet program veteran Boris Chertok, a deputy to Korolev.
Но видите ли, в каждом большом деле, когда человечество...
Every great act, every great undertaking of mankind and civilization requires a great leader. Korolev excelled in his character and took on responsibility which nobody asked him to.
Нужен кумир, вождь.
It seemed like he was sent by God.
Stephen Walker is the author of Beyond, a new book about Gagarin's historic flight. It's as much Korolev's story as it is the cosmonauts, but at the time, the engineer's identity was cloaked in secrecy.
He is the architect not only of the Soviet missile program, nuclear missile program, but also of the race to space with the United States, putting satellites and dogs and then finally a human being in space. He is a really powerful and utterly secret character. And the CIA are desperately trying to find his identity, but he's protected everywhere he goes around the USSR by KGB bodyguards to prevent the CIA from either kidnapping him or possibly assassinating him. He's that important.
Until his death, Korolev was known only as the chief designer. His true genius was not in technical or engineering matters. It lay in his ability to manage and inspire the engineers who worked for him. But it also lay in his political cunning and his ability to navigate and manipulate the multi-headed Soviet military-industrial political complex for his own purposes and dreams. Slava Gerovich, Soviet space historian at MIT.
The Soviet space enterprise was essentially driven from below. It was not driven by the Soviet government, but it was driven by space enthusiasts amongst rocket engineers, more specifically Sergei Korolev. These people went into rocketry really with space aspirations. So they built ICBMs with the thought on their mind that they might use those ICBMs for space exploration. That was the reason for Korolev choosing a particular type of fuel for ICBM that he built, liquid oxygen, which was not a very efficient fuel for a military missile. It took 24 hours to fuel the rocket. It's not a very rapid response weapon, but it's perfect for space exploration. So for Korolev, the top priority was designing rockets that would eventually be suitable for space exploration. Just getting support for them as military weapons was essentially a tool for him to pursue his dream.
After satellites, animals, and the first probes to fly around the moon, the next step for Korolev was to send a man into space. So where did that man come from?
Many people seem to be interested in my life story.
Stephen Walker and Soviet space historian Andrew Jenks, author of The Cosmonaut Who Couldn't Stop Smiling.
Born in 1934, he was a child of the Soviet system, the first really generation fully brought up in the system that Stalin had created of collectivization, state-run industrialization.
He is brought up in a little tiny village to begin with, sort of 80 or 90 miles to the west of Moscow, in the middle of the countryside. He comes from a sort of peasant background. His father is a carpenter.
As a boy, lived under the Soviet Union being occupied in its western portions by the Nazis.
Terrible trauma in the Second World War when the Nazis race across the border in June 1941 and invade. They sweep over this village, burn down half the houses, kick the Gagarins out of their home, and the Gagarins then live in a sort of dugout, which is built by the father for the rest of the war.
Gagarin shared stories of these hardships with his daughter Elena, interviewed for the BBC on the 50th anniversary of his flight.
The life was extremely difficult. There was no food, no possibility to study. The school was closed and they didn't study for 3 years. Only after the city was occupied by Soviet troops, they began to study at school, and the life was so difficult that they even had no paper to write.
These formative experiences shaped the character of young Yuri Gagarin.
He was very kind of openly very sunny and had a very sunny disposition, but there was a kind of an inner toughness.
Stephen Walker picks up the story in 1950.
He goes and studies to become a foundry worker in a large but closed town called Saratov on the Volga, about 600 kilometers south of Moscow. And then he starts flying for a local sort of military flying club, learns to fly, gets excited about it. And then to cut a long story short, he does very well. He ends up going to fly fighters for the Red Air Force up somewhere in the very far north of Russia, right on the border with Norway. So he's right on the fault line of the Cold War. And then one day, summer of 1959, some doctors turn up at this airfield and they start asking sort of to see and interview people who might be willing to volunteer for a mission to fly a new type of flying machine. And intrigued, he goes and has this meeting along with several of his fellow pilots on the station.
And is that how it's related, a new kind of flying machine? I mean, I'm assuming it's shrouded in secrecy at this point.
Absolutely shrouded in secrecy. They are not told what kind of a flying machine it is. And it turns out that these doctors, there were several teams of them, were roaming across a large chunk of Western Russia, going to these military bases and interviewing suitably qualified fighter pilots in their sort of 20s, of a certain kind of height and weight, with a certain level of flying experience, but not necessarily too much, and saying the same things. And those ones that they liked the look of, and those who said they were willing to volunteer for whatever this was going to be, were invited to a hospital in Moscow to spend a month undergoing some of the most horrible, brutal, gruesome, and ruthless medical and psychological tests imaginable.
And in February 1960, the first 12 were selected, and only then were told that their new flying machine was in fact a spacecraft. Most of them, Yuri included, had already suspected this, and the battery of psychological tests they'd endured now made sense. Kathleen Lewis of the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C.
At that point, both the United States and the USSR had demonstrated that they could send animals up and bring them back safely. What they were concerned with at the time was, would a human being, would a man, be able to maintain his reason while in orbit?
There was a real fear that there would be this condition called space horror, and that a human being would go insane, divorced from reality, divorced from the world below, utterly alone up there in space.
Remarkably, the final decision about who among the so-called Vostok 12 would be selected for the first flight was not taken until just 2 days before the launch. But in a deeply competitive field, Gagarin always looked like a real contender.
He performed the best of the whole group in so-called isolation tests. Cosmonauts were put in an isolation chamber for a few days with sensory deprivation, no light, no sound, no smell. And he was able to withstand these conditions very well. He would sing, he would talk to himself, and he would come out of that isolation chamber very cheerful, in good moods. And he really looked like the most psychologically stable of the whole group.
I think where Gagarin stood out is that he also illustrated to others that he was capable of withstanding the forces of the celebrity that would come after the flight. He had an optimism and a really charismatic and enchanting smile that everyone noticed. And he brought that into the Soviet space program as part of that first cohort. And so, it's like any situation where you have a number of good candidates for a job. There are the intangibles that ultimately decide who gets the job. And in this particular case, the intangible is charisma, the smile, the likability, He had it.
The spacecraft was called Vostok, Russian for East. It consisted of a cramped sphere just 2.5 meters across, which housed the cosmonaut, who was left with little to interact with directly, apart from the communication equipment. Attached was a second module, which contained the rocket engine for bringing Vostok out of orbit and back down to Earth, along with some thrusters for adjusting the vehicle's attitude and orientation. This so-called instrument module was designed to separate from Gagarin's sphere before reaching the atmosphere. The mission was designed so that if all went to plan, there would be nothing for the cosmonaut to do except endure and survive.
The first flight was fully automated. The space engineers, who essentially ran the space program, imposed the mission protocol according to which the entire mission would run automatically, while the cosmonaut would be able to step in only in case of emergency and only by permission from ground control. There were only 2 manual control functions available: attitude correction and retro rocket firing for re-entry. If everything went well, however, the cosmonaut was forbidden to use any controls. So the designer of Vostok's manual control system jokingly summed up the cosmonaut's instructions in 4 words: do not touch anything.
Spaceflight will never be routine. Even today, launches are fraught with hazard. But this is nothing compared with the dense uncertainty and risk that accompanied the delivery of the first human into space aboard Vostok 1. Of the 5 previous uncrewed test flights, only 1 had been completely successful.
Only 4 actually fired from the launch pad, only 3 reached orbit, only 2 descended, and only 1 had a normal landing. So it was not a very stellar record.
In the first few months of 1961, the Soviets' Vostok program and its American counterpart, the Mercury program, were more or less at level pegging in their bid to send a man into space. However, the Americans were at a disadvantage. Their program, its delays, warts and all, were out in the open and broadcast to the world. But the Soviet operation and its shortcuts were, as ever, veiled behind a thick curtain of secrecy. And all was far from well.
In the desperate race to beat the Americans in this one thing, a race that really comes down to the wire, huge shortcuts were taken. I mean, at one point, they weren't even going to design a spacesuit because they didn't have time. And finally, they just decided, well, we'll do it. And they did do it just about in time. Huge numbers of things had not even been tested in the Vostok capsule in which Yuri Gagarin was to fly. There were problems with the missile called an R-7. There were problems with some of the stages of the engines. There were problems with the retro-rocket to bring him back to Earth. There were problems after problems after problems that kept everyone up awake at night.
The Soviet intelligence service, the KGB, also feared mission failure. And one of its greatest concerns was that the Vostok spacecraft might veer off course and return to Earth in enemy territory. One senior KGB officer demanded a drastic remedy if it looked like that might happen. It was a deadly solution that had already been flown aboard previous test flights of the vehicle, in missions carrying dogs.
In these dogflights, in order to protect the technology of this Vostok capsule, the KGB insisted that bombs were placed on board these capsules. And the idea would be that these bombs would automatically trigger. They would blow up the capsule and blow up the dog or dogs inside it, should the capsule by mistake be entering the atmosphere or re-entering the atmosphere at the wrong point, and thereby end up in a capitalist country like the United States. And then the Americans get all the secrets. So they literally put these bombs on board. So in the case of the manned flight, there was a discussion that takes place a few days before Yuri Gagarin's flight, in which a very senior KGB general called Ivashutin actually insists that one of these bombs is put on board the first human flight as well. So that if Yuri Gagarin, as it certainly became, went mad in space or decided to steer his ship towards California or something like that, it would just get blown up with him inside.
I mean, I think I hadn't considered until now that idea of a spacecraft as a vehicle for potential defection.
But the KGB didn't trust anybody. It didn't happen, by the way. They didn't put the bomb on board, but it was there. It was very seriously discussed, literally within a couple of weeks of the flight happening.
By the first week of April, the space program and its political overlords had a critical decision to make. They'd narrowed down the cosmonaut for Vostok 1 to 2 choices: 25-year-old Herman Titov or Yuri Gagarin, 2 years his senior. On the 10th, just 2 days before launch, they picked Yuri. Gagarin wrote a letter to his wife Valentina and their 2 young daughters to be read only if he failed to survive the mission.
My dear beloved Valechka, Lenochka and Galochka, I decided to write you a few lines to share with you the joy and happiness that befell me today. Today the government commission decided to send me on the first spaceflight. I am so glad, dear Valyusha, and I want you to share this joy with me. An ordinary man, I have been trusted with an important national mission to pave the first road into space. I fully trust the technology. It should not fail. But it sometimes happens that a man falls and breaks his neck for no reason at all, and something may happen here too. But if it does, I ask all of you, and especially you, Valyusha, do not be overcome with grief. Please, take care of our girls and love them just like I do. Please, raise them as true human beings who are not afraid of the challenges of life. Raise them as people who deserve to live in a new communist society.
In the next half hour, we follow Yuri Gagarin as he arrives at the launch pad in Kazakhstan and makes his historic flight into space, hurtling around the Earth in just over an hour, seeing and feeling what no human had experienced before.
Now on the BBC World Service,
50,000 feet above the lunar surface. Since emerging from the dark side of the moon, communications between the spacecraft and Houston have been erratic. The atmosphere in mission control is tense and uneasy, and there's a race against fuel. On the 20th of July, 1969, Apollo 11 made a giant leap. But in its last 13 minutes, it almost didn't land. NASA's most daring mission, and one of the most momentous days in human history, told by the people who, one night in the summer of 1969, took man to the moon. 13 minutes to the moon.
Listen to the whole series now at bbcworldservice.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Coming up on the BBC World Service, Part 2 of Gagarin and the Lost Moon with me, Kevin Fong. We rejoin Yuri Gagarin as he arrives at the launch pad for his historic flight into orbit. He returns to Earth a hero of the communist world and becomes an international celebrity. But triumph turns to frustration, failure, and finally, disaster.
BBC News, we're Jerry Smith. The former South African President Jacob Zuma has pleaded not guilty to numerous charges of corruption and fraud relating to an arms deal in the 1990s. Hundreds of his supporters gathered outside the Pietermaritzburg High Court. Mr. Zuma has described the trial as a politically motivated witch hunt. The president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, has defended the forced diversion of a commercial airliner to Minsk, where an opposition journalist was taken from the plane and arrested. In his first comments since the incident on Sunday, Mr. Lukashenko said he acted in line with international law. WhatsApp is suing the Indian government over new laws that will compel it to violate privacy protections. The legislation requires internet companies to trace the origins of inflammatory messages. WhatsApp says it means it will have to break the end-to-end encryption its users enjoy. The former chief aide to Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said the government failed the public in its response to the coronavirus pandemic. Dominic Cummings told a panel of MPs he was sorry for the mistakes. Government figures show